Oh, no.
I'm not speaking today.
You said you had an announcement. That's your announcement.
That's my announcement.
Why do they call you Lou?
That's my name.
And if there are no other announcements, our president is going to introduce our program for today.
A couple, 3 months ago, I got an email from a woman who said, "My name is Sue Filbin." And she explained that Cliff Digre's daughter Kathleen and she have been best friends since they were little girls. And so she asked my wife and me to be her guests at the Women's Club of Minneapolis, where she gave the presentation that she's going to give today. Also, Cliff originally wanted to give the presentation, and he was involved, and Sue will get into Cliff's involvement there. But our cake and ice cream today were furnished by the Digre family. Bernice, Cliff's wife, is right here with 2 of her grandchildren, and we thank them very much. And Sue is supposed to read off this little piece of paper. Never have taken orders very well. Anyway, there's an Englishman who wants to start, or is getting up, a memorial, and he's calling it the Forgotten Fortress. And that is what Sue is going to talk about today. So, Sue Filbin.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm pleased and honored to be here. First of all, I want to thank all of you for your service to our country, and thank you for your interest in today's program. And while we're at the stage of introductions, Bernice Digre, Cliff's widow, would like to thank you.
No, I just want to say thank you for your friendship with Cliff. He was so fond of this group, and I just want to say thanks.
Cliff and Bernice's younger daughter, Carrie, is here today, and granddaughter, Tita. As Steve mentioned, there are 2 parts to today's presentation. The first is to let you know how your member, the late Cliff Digre, became acquainted with the pilot of the Forgotten Fortress, the B-17 that crashed in England in 1944. And then part 2 of today's presentation is to introduce you to the initiative made by Michael Rainsbury, a man who lives in Warwickshire, England, Shakespeare country, who grew up near that site of where the bomber crashed. He has started an initiative as a volunteer and formed a team to design and dedicate a memorial to the crew and to determine what the actual facts are about that crash, because the records aren't clear, and to find the families for the crew members who perished in that crash. And as Steve mentioned, Kathleen Digre and I have been pals since kindergarten. So when Kathleen called and said, "Sue, would you help my dad with his book?" how could I resist? I thought, more fun with the Digre family. So we produced the book, and that's in part how Cliff became acquainted with your group, the 8th Air Force Historical Society of Minnesota, thinking that these are my comrades, these are fellows who've been through some of the same situations as have I. And I fortunately became Cliff's publicist, secretary, and sidekick, so that's how I became involved in this project. Cliff kept a diary during his service in World War II, and although he had a terrific memory, those notes served him well, the notes from the diary. Cliff grew up in Hendricks, Minnesota, which is the very southwest corner of the state, right on the border with South Dakota. And after he graduated from high school, he figured he would be drafted. He graduated in 1941. the war was coming. So he attended an aircraft school in Minneapolis, and then through an instructor there worked at an aircraft manufacturing company in San Diego until he was drafted in May of 1943. And he chose the Army Air Corps. That's what he wanted to do, and he got his wish. He served as a ball turret gunner and also as a radio operator. He had training in the Signal Corps. And as Steve mentioned, the first time I made a similar presentation, the audience was mainly retired career women. And I thought, they might not know a lot about the B-17 because I didn't until I started to work with Cliff. So this is a helpful diagram. All of you know this inside out, but it was helpful for me. And I've been privileged to attend with Cliff and his family the air expos at the Eden Prairie Flying Cloud Airport and toured the B-17. And after listening about it and hearing from you, it's quite, just spellbinding craft, I thought, and surprisingly small. The ball turret, the radio. This is a photo of William T. Robertson, Robbie, who became Cliff's pilot. And rather than accepting a list from a clerk, Robbie went to the huts where the fellows were staying and interviewed several members for each position. And Cliff thought he was such a fine man and such a leader, I'd sure like to fly with him. And that became the case. Cliff became part of the Robbie Robertson crew. This is the co-pilot of the Robbie Robertson crew, Clifford Hendrickson from Indiana. And he, too, had plenty of flying experience, was happy to be the co-pilot with Robbie as the pilot. And together they formed a really cohesive crew, the 10 crew members. And you know how that feels. Your life is in the hands of another crew member and you're depending on them to do their best for you, and they come through for you. So that's the camaraderie Cliff felt about his crew. After that crew flew 18 missions, Robbie was made a lead pilot, which meant that their crew was disbanding. This is another shot of Clifford Henderson, the co-pilot, who then was made a pilot of a new crew, of which Clifford Digre became a part. So some of the fellows from the Robbie Robertson crew were part of this new crew. And they flew practice missions for a couple weeks. This was in December of 1943 when the weather allowed. You all know this, but the Ardennes offensive, which was the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, began on December 16th, 1944. The weather in England was so poor at that time that no planes were taking off. And the Germans knew this and took advantage of that, and the Allied forces were suffering in Belgium and in the Ardennes region. Finally, the weather cleared. And Clifford Henderson, the pilot, said to his new crew, "We'll be flying tomorrow, so get a good night's rest." Clifford Digre was excited this would be the first mission for his new crew, so he was up early, and when the orderly person came into their hut, he says to Cliff, "What are you up for, Digre? You're not flying today." Well, Cliff Digre knew better. He'd seen his name on the loading list, and this is a replica of a loading list. That actual loading list is lost because Cliff saw his name on the loading list, knew he'd be flying with his new crew, and then somehow in the middle of the night, that changed. And Clifford Hendrickson, the new pilot, was given a brand new crew to fly their first mission with an experienced pilot. And Clifford Henderson couldn't explain it. You know, they encountered each other at the mess, the briefing. Clifford Henderson said, "I don't know why that change was made. We'll be flying together tomorrow." So Cliff Digre, he's ready. He's had breakfast, goes down to the field and watches about 20 planes take off before the field is closed due to bad weather. And that mission was to Gmünd, Germany, which was an important railway center. That afternoon, Cliff Digre and a couple of his mates then went back to the field to welcome home the flight after that bombing mission. Very few planes returned because there again, the weather was so terrible that the base was closed. And all of those planes were diverted to southwestern England, the Cornwall area. And Michael Rainsbury, whom I mentioned, the initiator of the memorial to the crew, has been to Portreath, which was the base, the Royal Air Force Base where our fellows were diverted, and took this picture. It's a present-day base, very small, very at the edge of England, which is probably not the proper way to say it, but facing the sea and pretty isolated. Well, they have hundreds of planes descending on them and just piling in and parking wherever they could, and drinking gallons of tea and eating tons of food and smoking all the cigarettes in all the towns anywhere nearby. And this is an account that Michael Rainsbury was able to hear from a pilot who was there in Portreath, the late Will Fluman. Michael Rainsbury talked with Will Fluman just 3 days before he died in February of 2012 to get that first-hand account. Finally, on December 23rd, the weather cleared and the planes were actually able to leave Portreath. And Portreath was just one of the way stations. There were Allied American 8th Air Force planes throughout England wherever the weather had been good. So they're allowed to fly back to their bases because the weather's breaking. And the last planes in were the first planes out. And evidently Clifford Henderson and Robbie's planes, anyway, they were among the last to leave. Hope you can see this map well enough, but in the your lower left corner is Portreath, or the vicinity of Portreath. So you can see where our crew was. The middle X is where the plane crashed, which is the story today. And the far right X is their home base of Glatton near Peterborough, which is where they were heading. None of them knew that on the 24th was going to be a huge offensive as part of the Battle of the Bulge, because the weather forecast was for clear air. So it was important, even though Clifford Hendrickson's crew left very late, like 4:30, and they flew into darkness. It was, I think, important militarily that all the planes be back at their home bases. I'm going to read from page 114 of Cliff Digre's book, which I probably forgot to hold up, but this is, many of you have read it. A copy of it is here in the library. And I'm paraphrasing, just doesn't do justice to Cliff's language and some of the rest of the reading I'll do, because it's important to hear their emotion and the way they express themselves. Robbie and Cliff decided they would fly somewhat together. They were in radio contact, and Cliff was flying off Robbie's left wing at an altitude above the clouds. The radio operator later described it. We were both in clear blue skies when suddenly we lost radio contact. Then slowly but seemingly in control, Cliff's plane descended into the clouds and out of sight, and continued to be out of radio contact. 2 hours after Robbie's plane landed at their base, Glatton, near Peterborough, it was learned that Hendrickson's plane had crashed. And in Cliff Digre's book, he says, all 9 aboard had been killed. This is a picture of that crew. Because Clifford Hendrickson was the pilot, their co-pilot was nudged, and the pilot of this new crew became the co-pilot. So it's not completely accurate, but you have a sense of who these fellows were. That crash took place at a little community called Great Rollright, and it was around 6 o'clock at night, December 23rd, 1944. It was dark, foggy, terrible weather, and a huge crash. And these are times when people in Britain were keeping the lights out. It must have been terrifying, and plenty of people heard that crash, including a nurse from a nearby hospital, Elined Megan Lewis. And when she heard the crash, she grabbed her medical bag, found her car, drove with just slits of headlights, and found the crash in about 10 minutes. And then crawled into the fuselage to help. She pulled out the men and administered morphine. And Michael Rainsbury has explained to us there was no way that she would know that there weren't live bombs on that plane. So she dove in to do what nurses do. And several citizens from the community also helped to save these fellows. 4 of the men died right there on impact. We're going to change tempo here a little bit. This is a photo of one of the huts that the soldiers, in which the soldiers lived at Glatton. Cliff and Bernice took 3 trips to England in 1966, 1971, and 1998. And sometimes I know Kathleen and her husband Michael and family members accompanied them. At any rate, every time they went to England, they stopped at Cliff's base and visited and remembered and conversed. Remember how much Cliff enjoyed visiting? Well, he would visit with men and people on the street. And in 1998, they had grand conversations and supper with Bernie Baines, who's pictured here with his wife Sadie. Bernie Baines was the British historian for the 457th Bomb Group. And by 1998, more information about this crash and this particular incident was coming to light because the records really were partial and inaccurate. I'm going to read here once again from Cliff's book, page 116 this time. This is from 1998, so it's, many years, decades after the crash in 1944. Cliff said that he learned from Bernie Baines that the crash occurred 2 miles north of Great Rollright, not near Oxford. I believe it's about a half hour separating Oxford from Great Rollright. But that's the information Cliff had been told because after that crash happened, Cliff really intended to go wherever that crash had been and talk with people and ask them, what did you see? What did you hear? What happened? What information can you give me about the man who was to be my new pilot? And he never could make that trip because he couldn't get any straight information. People in charge of that information said, oh, it's Oxford and it's Great Rollerton, which is what Cliff put in his book because it's the best information he had. Suddenly, he's got accurate information. The accident investigation concluded the crew became lost, and while attempting an instrument letdown, the aircraft flew into the ground. One of the crew had major injuries but survived the crash. So this is new information. In 1944, it was assumed everyone perished, all 9 of the crew. And Cliff goes on to say the one survivor was Clifford Heinrich. Many, many times during these past 50-plus years, I've thought about that incident and wondered if Cliff Digre himself had been on that crew, as he should have been, would have he been the one survivor? He had no way of knowing, but he kind of doubted it, which made him always grateful for the chance to live a full life. But he said, if that man did survive, it sure would be interesting to talk with him. That would truly be the ending to this story. This is an image from another British historian, James Tobin, and the flight, I have to interrupt myself a little and show you. So this is Great Rollright, and fortunately the flight didn't land in the town. It went to the side of it, and we have an aerial shot that Michael Rainsbury captured, I think from Google, of the fields that the flight went through, the grove of trees, and the sturdy walls that broke their pattern of flight, but ultimately caused the crash of that flight. This is good. This is information from Michael Rainsbury. At the bottom of the screen, you can see the plane that flies over the field and then through the trees and crosses another field and then crashes into walls that have been there for thousands of years, I think. Or, well, sorry, I don't know. A long, long time. And are really sturdy, so that even a flying B-17 was stopped by those walls. James Tobin, whom I mentioned, is a fellow who retired in 2007. He was born in the village of Hook Norton, which is very near Great Rollright, and he and people in that area have a great interest in these situations, and so he does presentations about the World War II history for these small towns in England. And so he was very interested in this particular flight and the crash and didn't have much information and found Cliff's book on the internet and was happy to have the information. And then through a mutual friend, a gal named Allison, introduced James Tobin to Michael Rainsbury. So then we have a fine connection of good people trying to gain information. This photo shows the gap in the trees where the airplane flew through those trees that haven't grown back after all this time. And James Tobin said that anytime we traveled near the village of Great Rollright, where the crash took place, someone would often say, pointing to a gap, of course, that's where the American bomber crashed through the trees. It's time for part 2. How are you doing? To introduce Michael Rainsbury to you. He grew up about a mile from the crash site. And here is Michael on the right and Kathleen Digre, Cliff and Bernice's older daughter, on the left. And he, in the first email that he wrote to Cliff Digre, he said, as a child, I was totally obsessed with World War II planes and made dozens of them, including the B-17. I've been moved by the story of the 812, that rookie crew on their first mission being piloted by a guy who looked like Clark Gable. This is a photo Cliff Digre took of Clifford Hendrickson. Michael Rainsbury went on to say, I want to tell the full story of this crew and where they came from. I also want to ensure that they are accorded the equal honor and respect for their sacrifice. We also wish, and he's speaking of a team of volunteers that he's assembled, we also wish to invite the families of the 812 to come over to England for the dedication of the memorial. One of the things that, well, here we are to remind ourselves of the crew. One of the things that Michael and the volunteers did was engage metal detectors, find a day with pleasant weather, and go out and figure out just what was the flight path anyway. And because the path was over farm fields, there's debris still there that gets turned up every season when the field is plowed. So all these decades later, there's still debris. And in fact, Kathleen and her husband were there in April, and you're welcome to come up afterward, but Michael said, please take some of this detritus with you. The perspex and some cowling and a little bit of soil. I mentioned the team. James Tobin is part of that team, as are 2 pilots who served in the Royal Air Force in the Gulf War, and they have made many discoveries. Among them is that the accident report, impartial or inadequate, well, I shouldn't editorialize, but not very complete, attributes 75% responsibility to pilot error and the remaining 25% to the weather. The crash of the 812 does not even feature in the official unit history of the 457th Bombardment Group as held by the Department of the Air Force at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. So even though you're seeking more information, it's not there. This is one reason why Michael Rainsbury named the 812 the Forgotten Fortress. Well, Michael and his team were with the metal detectors in the field and doing their research. He asked Cliff and me, Cliff didn't have email, but I did, if we could please work on finding the families of the crew. So I did a little Google search and didn't come up with much. But in the meantime, my husband Dan's cousin Gary is married to Linda. And Linda was sending emails with pictures of great-grandparents and saying, I just love doing this. I love finding these family members. This is thrilling for me. And Cliff and I thought, she's our gal. Let's ask Linda if she would please volunteer her time to find the families of crew members. So I sent her an email the next day, and this was May 1st, last year, 2012. Linda wrote back and said, I'd be happy to help, but I can tell you that due to privacy issues, it's more difficult to locate living relatives than deceased family. Well, Linda, we had a list. I mean, Cliff Digre has a list of the crew in his book. Michael Rainsbury had a list. So we knew names and identity numbers. Sorry, your serial number. No, that's not what you call it. Your serial number. Sorry. We knew that information and the position that each crew member flew. And with that information, we sent that to Linda, and she started digging into the information. And one of the first people she encountered was a gal named Helen in New York, who was related very distantly to the navigator. And Helen said, well, my dad and I have been working on a little family ancestry, not this navigator, but hey, I'd be glad to help. And she started to dig in and says, I'm addicted to the search now, with an exclamation point. On May 7th, so Linda and Helen have been digging into the information, and this, by the way, is George Brewer from St. Augustine, Florida, and his wife. So they found family photos through Ancestry.com. Linda has an account with them, and that made all the difference. That you can find these records and find obituaries and contact funeral homes and genealogy departments in libraries and make a thorough, fruitful search. But on May 7th, we received an email from Linda, and she wrote and said, I had the most phenomenal phone conversation with Clifford Heinrich's cousin. And Clifford Hinrich is the person who we didn't know, did he live or not? You know, Cliff Digre wondered in his book. And Linda writes, Cliff is alive and well. I had absolutely no idea and was so overwhelmed it brought me to tears. Clifford is alive. And here's a photo of Clifford Hinrich, who now lives in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Well, naturally, Michael Rainsbury, along with Cliff and me, received this email, and he writes back and he says, I think I might be in shock. I am utterly speechless. We have 2 former RAF pilots as part of our crash investigation team. These 2 guys fly long haul for British Airways and Virgin these days, but they used to be tornado pilots and have a deep sense of honor and duty when it comes to finding out what happened to the combat crew of the 812. These pilots have been working on the available evidence, trying to find out why the 812 crashed. We have a ton of questions we need to ask Clifford Hinrich, as we have a hunch that Hendrickson, the pilot, was unfairly held responsible for this fatal accident. Clifford Hinrich could hold the key. And then on May 20th, just a few days later, Michael Rainsbury sent another email, and he said to us, I interviewed Clifford Hinrich by phone yesterday afternoon. His voice cracked with emotion and trauma when he said that God was with me on that day. Clifford told me, and this is Michael speaking or writing, that the 812 was flying at treetop height due to the fog. It was dark. He said they were dipping below the cloud layer. There was no technical fault with the aircraft. He, Clifford, spent 14 months in hospital with his massive injuries. He was never interviewed by crash investigating officers and had no contact with any family member of the crew. He was awarded a Purple Heart. Clifford Hinrich is 88, and Linda and I believe that someone, a young person, wrote this note on behalf of Clifford Heinrich that he signed, that he sent to Linda, and said thank you for the picture of his crew and information about the crash. I had no idea where we crashed. Thanks again, and God bless. Clifford. When Cliff Digre received this news about Clifford Heinrich being alive, he contacted James Bass, who's an attorney from the Nashville area and who is the 457th Bomb Group official historian and past president of that bomb group and author of 3 books about the history of the 457th Bomb Group. Fait accompli is the title of those books. Well, he visited Clifford Heinrich. He went to Missouri from Tennessee and took that photo that we have and talked with Clifford Heinrich. And this is what Clifford Heinrich told James Bass. After takeoff, Clifford Heinrich went to his position in the tail. He said they were flying a treetop level, and he returned to the radio room. Also, there was the radio operator and the ball turret gunner. He and the ball turret gunner sat in the radio room on the floor with their backs against the bulkhead, separating the radio room and the bomb bay, which would be the position for takeoffs and landings. They had no forewarning of the crash, and he doesn't remember the crash. He sustained head and leg injuries that had him hospitalized for 14 months. And then he said, he's just had no contact with any member of the crew, of course, but any of their family. That was in July that James Bass interviewed Clifford Heinrich. On August 1st, 2012, Michael Rainsbury sent an email and said, although I am responsible for starting this whole thing, it is thanks to Cliff Digre's own network in the USA that we found Clifford Heinrich. Cliff Digre can take full credit for helping to make such a huge difference to this project. And Michael went on to say that he's nailed down a navigator who was part of that mission to Gruen, Germany, who did spend time in Portreif. And according to Michael and Bill Seiler, the navigator, it is looking more and more possible that the 812 simply never knew that there was a hill that they crashed into, or that caused the crash, that's 738 feet of elevation directly in their path. The next nearest hill is several hundred feet shorter. And a big mystery that Michael has been working on is why did the plane seem to be heading north rather than northeast to Glatton? And he believes it's because Glatton was closed because of bad weather, and then this plane was on their own to find a friendly airbase that could accommodate them in terrible weather. They had 2 hours worth of fuel, so the fuel might have been running low. There could have been ice starting to build up on the wings, but they evidently may have determined that there were 2 air bases north that Michael is still working on. And Michael went on to say, I think these boys died because they followed the standard procedure and never had the most basic of information. It's Clifford Henderson again. Clifford Heinrich. This is a photo taken by Kathleen Digre's husband, Michael Varner, of Kathleen and Michael Rainsbury standing in a field that is part of the flight path of the 812. And there are, if you can see them, bunches of daffodils planted, and people seem to think that the nurse, Eleanor Megan Lewis, planted those bunches of daffodils, one for each of the crew members. And in addition, of course, to visiting with Michael, they actually walked the flight path and picked up these pieces of debris from that flight. And for those of you, not everybody will be able to crowd around, I took a photo of what I have here on just a paper plate so you can see the scale a little bit. There's, at the top of a hill at Great Rollright is these Rollright stones, and it's a little bit like Stonehenge and may have been a burial ground, and it is about 3,500 years old, and it's at the top of the hill. But it's from this type of stone that the monument will be created, and someone has committed to donating an 11-ton stone that will be moved and installed at the site of the crash. So Michael Varner and Kathleen Digre were able to see that particular area. I'll close with one last email from Michael Rainsbury. This was written in October 2012, a little more than a month before Cliff Digre died. Please tell Cliff that this coming Remembrance Day on 11 November, special mention is being made of the lost crew of the 812 in the twin churches of Great Rollright and Hook Norton, a nearby town. This is our big war remembrance event in the UK and is a huge occasion. The entire community here where the 812 crashed will remember them and the debt we can never repay. There is a huge groundswell of support for this memorial project. Everywhere we go, people cannot do enough for those lost boys. This began when I named the Forgotten Fortress. Now they will be remembered forever. Thanks so much for your attention. If you have questions, I may or may not be able to answer them, or if you have comments, I will take notes. Mary? Yes.
When is the dedication planned for?
Great question. Michael's working on it and doesn't have a date, but within a year. Yeah, Mary asked about the date for the dedication of the memorial, and Michael Rainsbury is hoping within a year. Yeah. Thank you very much.